and welcome everyone to the first Australian Community Indicators Network seminar. I can see that people are still trickling in some offices, but in total we are about 120 people across 8 offices in capital cities across Australia, which I have to say is a pretty mean feat, and I thank the ABS for their amazing support in supporting this event and providing us with the technology and all of the support in each office. It's been a huge effort. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are all meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also want to say a few things about the format for the seminar. It's a standard seminar in the sense that we will have a keynote speaker, and I'll introduce Meg shortly, followed by the opportunity to ask questions. So after the presentation, we'll be taking a small break. So each room will be able to discuss and come forward with a couple of questions for Meg. We'll then join together as a whole group again to hear the questions and Meg's responses. And then the national hookup will end. The ABS have kindly booked the offices for a further hour, and we'll continue to meet in our local offices for those who can stay on for that time. So now I want to say just a few things about who's brought us here today, the Australian Community Indicators Network. And the network was born September last year in Sydney at the NatStats conference. There were a group of people, probably more than 40 people, who got together and agreed that there was a need for a national network of community indicator practitioners, researchers and policymakers. And that had come after several years of gatherings through things like the National Community Indicators Summit in Queensland the year before, and if we ask Mike Salvaris, he'll probably tell us a 15 or 20-year history of this movement in Australia that has now culminated to this point where we have quite strong interest and a growth of this work across Australia that brings us all together to this point. The role of the network is to assist people using or developing community indicators to share ideas, information and to foster collaboration. So this is the first of 2 events this year. There'll be another event later in the year that will have a focus on national community indicators with some presentations on the Australian National Development Index and measures of Australia's progress, so looking at the national picture. We've also established a website, and although at this stage it's rather clunky and you have to forgive us for that, it is an excellent point of exchange for those interested in community indicators. There's an opportunity for people to share information, to view other members, information about other members, to pose questions for each of us to think about and respond to. Following today's event, you will be given, there will be a follow-up email where you'll be given the link to the video seminar, so you'll be able to view it and share it with others again. There will also be given some further information about the Australian Community Indicators Network and how you can participate and join in. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce you to our speaker today, Meg Holden. Meg is an Associate Professor in Urban Studies and Geography at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver and is Director of the Regional Vancouver Urban Observatory. Meg is best known within the community indicators field for her work on urban sustainability and quality of life indicators, which has involved research in North American cities as well as practice in developing indicator systems in Vancouver. She has also played a key role advising within the international indicators community through the Community Indicators Consortium, the Canadian Sustainability Network and Metropolis, the World Association of Major Metropolises and others. Meg's currently in Melbourne, lucky us, as a visiting scholar in the Global Cities Research Institute at RMIT University, and she's very kindly agreed to address today's seminar on the topic of best practice and emerging principles in the community indicators movement. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Meg, and thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sue, and thanks to everybody here in Melbourne, and thanks to the Australian Community Indicators Network and the Australian Bureau of Statistics for hosting this meeting. As Sue said, I've been in Melbourne now for about 5 months on a research leave and conducting some research in Melbourne, and It is my great chagrin that I'm not able to visit all of the cities in Australia during this short visit, so at least I get to see some of the best and brightest in Australian capital cities here today. So I hope today, maybe if we could switch to the slides, I hope that my presentation today will provide some fodder to instigate some dialogue within the newly minted Australian Community Indicator Network on what I've been able to synthesize regarding new trends and developments in the realm of community and urban indicators. I am an urbanist, but in most cases when you hear me say urban, you can safely substitute community in order to help you sort of contextualize what I'm doing with what might be more of interest to you. And my intent is to help advance understanding of the key alternatives available when designing and implementing various kinds of indicator systems, and the implications of these decisions for the impact of the system on people, policy, and trends. My own biases and background means that the themes I'm going to draw from are from community indicators, policy, and sustainable development fields. And my case examples today will primarily refer to Vancouver, although I'm happy to talk about other initiatives farther afield based on my work within the Canadian Sustainability Indicators Network, the U.S. Community Indicators Consortium, and the UN Habitat Global Urban Observatory Network. Not responding. There we go. Okay, so today I'd like to begin with some high-level thoughts about what the Global Community Indicators movement is up to and where it's headed, and some ideas about indicators that I think unify the field of practice and thought, as well as some sort of major forks in the road in the field as well. And then to bring this down to earth, I'll discuss three main examples of indicator system developments in the Vancouver region, where I'm from, and which are innovative for different reasons. The Vancouver Foundation's Vital Signs Report, the regional government's indicator initiatives, and the Olympic Games indicator impact system, which is being conducted on behalf of the International Olympic Committee. And then I'll conclude with some lessons and warnings and challenges for the future of community indicators work. So, the ultimate aim of the indicators movement is understanding, through research, evaluation, envisioning, for better policy, better education, better action, better interaction. Our challenge as advocates, managers, and other kinds of actors in cities and communities include such things as guiding and mitigating the negative effects of growth, working to adequately distribute the positive and negative impacts of growth, and development amongst diverse groups in the city. Safeguarding critical resources and the lives of the most marginalized and at risk amongst our populations, competing and hopefully collaborating for limited investment dollars, highly skilled immigrants, and positive reputation nationally and internationally, learning and continuous improvement across an increasingly diverse cross-section of fellow citizens. For those of us who seek understanding as a basis for action, for those with a rational vein in our bodies, all of these challenges point to an increasing need for better indicators. So what is an indicator? Just to sort of summarize something that I'm sure is obvious to everybody gathered here. Indicators intend to disclose, to point out, to make public, to announce, to estimate, and to value. We also try to target indicators that are able to communicate or show visually the condition of a larger system. It's that little piece of information that we think reflects a broader suite of information. The utility of an indicator-based assessment approach then is to represent many of our different interests in community development, urban development, and management. It is a worldwide movement. We see cities and countries all over the world joining in the community indicators movement. There is a range of models that is being advanced with no single sort of higher order goal emerging as yet as the dominant one. We see sustainability, quality of life, wellness, well-being, happiness. And there's a range of scope of expectations for policy and results at national as well as local government level. So why do we need indicators? We use indicators for a range of and a growing number of policy-relevant purposes, from adjusting market signals to designing educational systems to planning new neighborhoods. The information age and highly educated populace makes data more accessible and more in demand. Greater diversity of uses and interests means that data is being sought to answer a much wider range of questions at a range of scales. So the classical sort of bumper sticker of the indicators movement is what gets measured gets done, or we value what we measure, so we should measure what we value. Most significantly, the indicators movement has a sort of anti-GDP stance. Not necessarily anti-GDP, but the notion that the GDP has either outlived its value or is being applied in a different range of context than it was designed to apply to. That GDP does a shoddy job of measuring what we value in our nations and our communities. GDP sort of has a Cold War attitude about it. It pits us against them at a national scale in terms of roping and using important resources. And so the idea is that we need a different kind of measure of progress. At the same time, the indicators movement attempts to address other demands in terms of addressing new challenges to development, climate change, financial crises, crises of affordability in most of our developed world cities, to meet new and rising citizen expectations for engagement and for higher levels of quality of life, as well as to enable cities to compete on the international stage. So as the indicators movement globalizes for all of these reasons, pressure mounts to standardize indicator systems, and this is where I think the first major sort of schism in the indicators movement arises. To standardize or not to standardize. Most of you will have heard of some of the standard systems that are under development within indicators practice, with new indices of anything from total energy use to urban accessibility, city governance, creative cities, competitiveness, social capital. There are some interesting developments in North America. Some of you might have heard of the WALK score, which is a sort of computer-based algorithm that allows any sort of computer user to get a score calculated for the walkability of their neighborhood as a sort of indicator of the mixed use, the success of a mixed use development, for example. There's a standard for tracking sustainable urban development even being devised through the International Standards Organization. But there are trade-offs in increasing standardization of indicator systems. So the first slogan here, Better Information for Better Cities, comes from the UN Habitat Global Urban Observatory, which initially set out in the 1990s to develop a common suite of indicators that would enable them, the UN Habitat Agency tasked with guiding the better development of cities, to comparatively assess the progress of cities in terms of their development. They've been at it now for over 2 decades without much success in terms of coming up with that standard list of measurable indicators across the globe. And in fact, this sort of goal has now taken root at a relatively new center called the Global Cities Indicators Facility at the University of Toronto, with a very similar intent to this time asking for cities themselves to contribute the data to enable comparative assessment. The Regional Vancouver Urban Observatory that I direct in Vancouver turns this standardization approach on its head by saying, in fact, what we want are measures that match our local values, and starting from a position of seeking local input and guiding citizens to, sort of get out of the ruts of expected or established ways of expressing our values, to try and think in terms of the highest order good for development locally. The OECD World Project on Measuring the Progress of Societies, I imagine most of you would have heard of, takes yet another approach, here clearly intended towards standardization, and clearly being targeted to combat the hegemony of the GDP as the global measure of progress. But I think that it differs from the intent of the UN Habitat Global Urban Observatory in that it contains explicitly a stance towards what progress means that's been guided by Nobel Prize-winning economists Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Italian economist Fitoussi. So another of the big schisms, I think, in the indicators movement is between those projects that seek to increase demonstrable accountability, so that to rely on and report on performance, and those that seek to identify and mobilize action on important trends. There's an important issue of scope dividing these two approaches, I think, and a different theory of change that's in operation, and I'll return to this notion of a theory of change towards the end of my comments here. So from things within our control to maybe somewhere in the middle, things within our influence, and then at the bottom, things beyond our control. And some groups are more interested in directly targeting indicators within their responsibilities. Others are interested in pushing towards the promise of change, regardless of what their responsibilities are. And here's a somewhat more detailed description of the spectrum from high levels of control to lower levels of control in a bit more detail. You likely have heard of the distinction between input, output, and outcome indicators, or the very ugly acronym DIPSR, Driving Force, Pressure, State, Impact, Response, or the more evocative upstream-downstream distinction, all trying to characterize this distinction amongst indicators at different points on the pathway from the inputs that we can most directly control. So the yellow triangle here on this diagram, we could take, for example, the number of registered vehicles per capita in a jurisdiction, towards the outputs, the turquoise arrow, how many kilometers we drive, to the different phases of outputs, which could be proximate or direct outputs. The fossil fuel reliance of our society, the pollution in our air, how many illnesses we experience from spending so much time in our cars, how healthy our social relationships might be, et cetera, et cetera. The final key distinction that I'd like to make before we get into a discussion of some examples is the distinction between indicator projects as standalone initiatives and indicator projects as situated within a process of governance. If considered as situated within a process of governance, then we need to consider the elements of good governance when considering the elements of a successful indicators initiative. And I think this aspect to date is the least likely element of an indicator set to be covered well and effectively. And this is where we get the compulsion for a specific and justified stance towards public participation within the design and the implementation of indicator systems in particularly. But amongst a suite of, well, here we have 5 core elements of good governance. So taking all this into consideration, I think we have this list of must-dos within an effective community indicator system, that they should be applied within a structured framework. Whether this is a standardized framework or one that is more locally derived, I think, is up to the interests and sort of reasoned considerations of those at the helm. They should be applied to propose new initiatives at all levels of decision making, which is part of the elements of good governance, to existing practices across all sectors, to the prevailing policy and legislative paradigm, to any decision with the potential to impact patterns of production and consumption, governance and settlement, and by all sectors of society. Okay, so let's take a look at some cases from Vancouver. Not quite the metropolis that Melbourne is, but a city with a lot to be proud about as well in the realm of indicators work, maybe, but more in terms of our success or our dogged Canadian efforts to grow with grace. It's the largest unamalgamated region in Canada, which makes it probably more comparable to the Australian context of local governance than other Canadian cities. We do have a regional government, but it is not. It does not amalgamate local municipalities into a single metropolitan region, but it is a federation of local governments. Here's a view of Vancouver region taken from the top of Burnaby Mountain, where Simon Fraser University is, looking south. So you can see the Burrard Inlet, the green sort of almost the green peninsula in the top right of the corner is Stanley Park, and on the horizon is the Canada-US border. The downtown, I think, is pretty, you can probably see the tall buildings there, the downtown. Some of the challenges of the Vancouver region, very similar to what you're experiencing, I think, in most, if not all, Australian cities. Transportation and goods movement, waste concerns, water and air pollution concerns, crime, perceptions of crime, and how to manage growth and maintain a high degree of livability that residents have come to expect. So again, trotting out a particular version of standardized indicators reporting that gets a lot of coverage in the local press in Vancouver as well as Melbourne, the Economist Intelligence Unit's ranking of most livable cities. Like a number of Australian cities, Vancouver is highly rated in terms of its livability, but livability is not the same as sustainability, and Vancouver has policy goals in both livability and sustainability. So just to take a few minutes to sort of clarify the distinction, I think, between livability and sustainability, as an example of the distinctions that we can draw between a lot of these high-level goals towards which we aspire and sort of the terms for which we often use interchangeably. Livability has an emphasis on improving life conditions, life chances, or other factors within the narrowly defined boundaries of a city or a region. Sustainability, by contrast, aims to improve conditions within the boundaries of the city, but such that conditions beyond those boundaries are not negatively affected as well. Livability has a time frame of today, or within the current political time frame. Sustainability stretches beyond that time frame to look at 50 or 100-year time frames, certainly beyond the concerns of currently sitting politicians and political interests. Livability intends to improve conditions by reducing the negative impacts of development on the city. Sustainability, by contrast, attempts to improve conditions by using all byproducts of development within a closed-loop cycle or a systems type of thinking. And the Vancouver region, as I mentioned, has a long history of approaching both of these goals, trying to. The Livable Region Strategic Plan is currently the growth management plan for the metropolitan region of Vancouver. And the regional government itself is guided by the Sustainable Region Initiative, which sets sustainability as a priority for all of its policies and actions. The Mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Robertson, has set a goal for Vancouver to become the world's greenest city by 2020, and we're still trying to articulate and set measures for what specifically that entails. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that a big schism in the indicators field between those seeking increasingly global standardization and those seeking local legitimacy. And there is a hybrid sort of a model too, and that's the first example that I'd like to present for your consideration. And it's the example of vital signs, in which certain measures are standard, and they're set in Canada by the Community Foundations of Canada, which is an umbrella organization that unites all of the philanthropic community foundations in Canada. Others are locally defined by participating cities in this sort of Canadian franchise of Vital Signs Indicators project. And the presentation and process for designing and implementing the indicator system is also locally determined. So this is the newest and I think the most innovative indicator project in the Vancouver region for a number of reasons. It's been published now 4 times since 2006, and a report focusing specifically on issues and indicators related to youth in the region was also published in 2009. Unique to this project is its existence and its governance within a not-for-profit foundation as part of a Canada-wide, and I understand that Vital Signs has also recently been imported to the Australian context as well, franchise of projects. And also I think the approach to engagement is unique to this project, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is the structure for creating Vital Signs and the steps involved in the project in the left-hand bar. The project is organized by a project team which consists of Vancouver Foundation staff, not numbers people, not indicators people, but grants managers and directors for the Vancouver Foundation, which actually has a province-wide mandate for delivering grants and projects in a range of areas. The process begins in March of each year, and going forward the report will be produced biannually. So there is a design and research process for which the Vancouver Foundation engages a research team of 2 external research groups. One is local, the Regional Vancouver Urban Observatory, and the other is a national survey research group in order to conduct a piece of polling survey research as part of the research product. And then they also engage a leadership advisory group, which is pulled together of key leaders in important roles in the media, in business, in the civic sector, mayors and council members throughout the region, and an expert advisory group, and these are the indicators and the numbers people who have their fingers on the pulse of where to get the best data for different trends. And so the research process goes on with a lot of back and forth workshops and discussions between all of these groups. The Community Foundations of Canada also maintains a mostly electronic, given the size constraints of Canada, forum to facilitate engagement of all of the Vital Signs communities across Canada that are also going through this same research process. And Community Foundations of Canada decides on core indicators that will be reported by each of the participating communities and distributes that data electronically as well for uptake and use. The communication step comes next, and this is where I think if you visit the website, you can see that particularly the current iteration of the report, the 2010 report, excels. Vancouver Foundation engaged their own internal communications team, but also engaged an external communications firm in order to ensure that all the avenues of social media were employed. There was a video produced. They put a lot of effort into making the numbers jump off the page for people to ensure that this wasn't just a sort of a number crunching effort, but that it told a story about livability within the Vancouver region that made sense and also resonated with people across the region. The communications process then led to the launch event, which happened in early October, and had a lot of intensive working with the media at the time. There was a supplement to the major local newspaper published on the day of the physical launch, which was held sort of at a prime community venue. And also a supplement in the major Chinese language newspaper. And then to follow upon the launch and to make further inroads into getting the message about livability from the Vital Signs report out into the different communities region-wide, Vancouver Foundation has subsequently started a new arm of the project called Community Conversations. And this is mostly being conducted internally by the project team for the project as well as the Vancouver Foundation board. And they are working in concert with the local municipalities throughout the region, and there are 23 of them in Vancouver, in order to find out what the local governments would like to do or can envision doing with the report, how to engage their citizens, and then physically going out there to engage those people in a workshop as part of an ongoing effort. So here's a little bit more information about how the indicators were chosen locally for the report. So this list of criteria for indicator shortlisting is a compilation from the feedback that we got from the Leadership Advisory Group as well as the Expert Advisory Group. So these criteria were derived by participants in the process, over probably 5 workshops. It took a while to get to this level of consensus about what we were trying to do with the indicators. I'm not going to read those out. And then down in the bottom bar is the set of domains and areas for indicator reporting that were selected for this report. And here's just an example of the summary page for one of those domains, children and youth. Not an accidental choice. Child poverty affects a quarter of families with children in the Vancouver area, and that's compared with about 14% of families in Australia. So you can see here that the data-driven, the secondary data for the indicators that are reporting on the children and youth field appear in the bottom half of this slide, and the top half provide the summary results from the citizen opinion poll, which was taken across all of the domains to say, how are we doing in terms of addressing the needs of each of these domains. C+ was the grade given to children and youth. And then citizens were also asked for their top priorities in terms of how to move in a better direction in each of these domains. The other piece of primary research that is collected for the Vancouver Vital Signs report is summarized here, and it's a public opinion survey, the topic of which, or the themes of which, changes from year to year. In 2010, the survey focused on belonging, social capital, trust, and happiness. And in fact, interestingly, the Vancouver Foundation wanted happiness to be the theme for the entire report, but the Leadership Advisory Group was a little bit too hard-headed and thought that the report would be laughed out of the park if it focused on happiness, or it would be sort of devalued and considered not serious. So it appears as more of a minor kind of a minor sort of point. Okay, moving on to the second example, which are the suite of indicators being reported by Metro Vancouver, which is the name of our regional governance entity, which I mentioned earlier is a federated body of the mayors and councils of each of the 23 municipalities and First Nations in Vancouver. So I mentioned already the Livable Region Strategic Plan was passed in 1996 and is still our regional growth strategy, and within that there are a series of performance measures which must be reported on annually, and they are. Following that, and these are pretty basic in terms of development within the agricultural zone, which is forbidden, exclusions from the agricultural zone, inclusions. We have a policy of no net loss of agricultural land, dwellings within the green zone and within proximity to transit corridors, these kinds of measures. The Sustainable Region Initiative followed in 2001, and that sets higher level goals for sustainability within regional government. And it was also sort of the time at which the region took more of a stance towards engaging the region's population in measuring and monitoring sustainability. So at the top there, the LRSP, the Livable Region Strategic Plan monitoring indicators I mentioned. The sustainability report started out as an additional performance reporting initiative, but subsequently has turned into more of an external communications tool. So it is sort of sliding on the trajectory from performance measurement towards a community indicators device. Regional trends are also produced, and these are drawing from census and demographic updates sort of on a quarterly basis. And most recently, the region has launched a sustainability summit, which is a physical gathering of people across the region in order to seek their feedback and to collect a sort of more impressionistic, qualitative set of indicators on the pictures of success that various key actors have for sustainability in the region, as well as key actions that they think the region and other actors should undertake. And interestingly, there are moves afoot for the Vancouver Foundation to sort of co-sponsor and join in the Sustainability Summit with the regional government. So here's a picture of a map of the region. The LRSP was produced in 1996, as I mentioned. There has been for the past 3 years now an attempt to revise and update that regional growth strategy. It's currently being held up by one municipality. Consensus is required on this growth strategy in order to pass it. And it's the municipality of Coquitlam, which is sort of in the very center of the map that you see, because as you can see, the city of Coquitlam is creeping up the North Shore Mountains and is very uninterested in establishing the urban containment boundary, which is proposed in this slide. This is an example from the sustainability report from the regional government, just showing challenges and opportunities of population growth, increasing diversity, countered with trends in poverty rates, which are consistently higher than BC and Canada-wide averages, BC being the province in which Vancouver sits. And Metro Vancouver is the darkest blue line at the top here. And also challenges with homelessness. And I put this slide up in order just to speak for a minute to an interesting indicators-related initiative. The Vancouver Regional Steering Committee on Homelessness was established in 2000, which was the time we began regional street counts of homelessness. We do not have a census of the homeless in Canada, so this was our first attempt to try and get a handle on the scale of the problem of homelessness in our region. And so the growing numbers from 2002 to 2008 certainly in part reflect an increasing problem with street homelessness in Vancouver, but they also reflect the increasing popularity of the street count. We have now more volunteers than can actually be managed for the 24-hour street count that takes place in March, and they're getting to all parts of the region on the streets and knowing better how to engage and get the homeless people counted. It's also become a venue that few politicians will miss out on the opportunity to get out there for that night and help to count the homeless. Okay, I don't want to take too much more time. Just to mention briefly another kind of indicators report currently going on in Vancouver because we hosted the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. And this is the Olympic Games Impact Program, which was established by the International Olympic Committee in 2003 and is now a requirement for all host communities of the Olympic Games in order to demonstrate the impact, and the IOC certainly hopes the positive impact of the Olympic Games. There are 126 indicators. The project was designed by a university in Switzerland where the IOC is based. And one of the challenges that Vancouver has faced in reporting on these indicators is the difference between a small country like Switzerland and a very large country like Canada, where we certainly can't expect a change in air quality as a result of the Olympics to affect air quality in the eastern part of the country, although that's sort of the way that the project is framed. So here are a few examples just to sort of show you the challenges in terms of understanding this as a community indicators report. So progress in elite amateur sport in Canada, for example, being represented by Olympic athletes and top-level athletes. You can understand that there was significant pushback against this indicator from local and community sporting organizations whose funding was cut as a result of the emphasis on the Olympics during the time. And health and physical activity. Again, a complicated picture to paint in terms of what impact the Olympics might have had on ongoing nutritional and physical activity rates in Vancouver. So the problem of correlation versus causation, the problem of irresolvable data problems that we've faced in this report. Just one other sort of point on this, on the OGI report, is that its political positioning. The report is being conducted by researchers at the University of British Columbia, which at the time that Vancouver bid for and won the bid to host the Games was the site of resistance to the Games and had organized an Impact of the Olympics on Communities coalition that published this interim report card giving the Olympic authorities, and the local authorities planning the Olympics, a grade of D- on a number of fronts. So the opportunity to report on the Olympic Games global impact was given to the same group of researchers who were getting considerable press reporting on the limitations of the Games. And I'm just going to skip forward. One point to, I guess I would be remiss, given your own Australian emphasis on the Australian National Development Index, and I know that you'll be focusing a future event on this report or development, not to mention the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. This is another example of a report that developed within the philanthropic world in 1999 in Canada. but now has been moved to a university home, the University of Waterloo. And I'm showing here a list of the domains in the Index of Wellbeing. Each domain has now developed an initial report, and in my opinion, these are, the research that went into these reports is quite good at a pretty high level. And also of note is that each of these domain reports was accompanied by a report entitled Ideas for Positive Change, so linking the trends to action immediately. The next steps for the CIW are to combine the results of these domain reports into an index, and that work is ongoing. Okay, so just to conclude then, by airing some of the dirty laundry of the indicators movement. Most indicators, in my opinion, that are out there and that are being used in decision making are validators of existing practice. There are very few measures being used in policy contexts that are actually pushing the needle out of the groove. And what do I mean by that? Well, probably the best indicator designed by Sustainable Seattle, the organization that launched the Sustainability Indicators movement, was an indicator called number of wild salmon returning to local streams to spawn. Nothing that anybody previous to this report had ever thought of as a measure of urban development, certainly not in a policy context, but through a series of changes following the regular reporting and the media attention that was garnered to this particular indicator, Seattle and the county and the state in which it sits have launched a whole series of salmon stream habitat restoration projects and really moved the entire focus of species protection to a focus on habitat protection. They have begun a really innovative program of daylighting urban streams, which takes culverted streams and brings them to the surface again so that a future of fish-bearing streams in the urban area can again be envisioned. And I can leave to your imaginations the impacts that that might eventually have on a whole series of social and economic conditions in the city. So there is a preoccupation with indicators as accountability devices, and that's not a bad thing, but too much attention in this direction takes away from the potential role of indicators in change and innovation at policy as well as community levels. This I'm just showing as an example of another warning, which is the proliferation of indicators efforts and the lack of coordination and the ability to manage information flows. This is just a partial list of the sustainability-oriented indicators effort that affect the Vancouver region, and that's not even including the significant indicators work in what I would consider to be smaller sectoral domains, like we have an index of children's readiness for school, for example, which is quite a significant effort. And there's a concern about proliferation of information that's not being used. Also associated with this is another trend of concern, which is that of offloading of core government functions of collecting and distributing information to sometimes small nonprofits, sometimes larger nonprofits, but in all instances, initiatives without a core responsibility to represent and engage citizens. And I'll say that just that our current Conservative government in Canada has recently abolished the mandatory long-form census, which is a very troubling trend for the indicators community in Canada as a whole. Okay, last slide is just to get back to my point about theories of policy change. I think most indicators efforts derive from a rational theory of policy change that with better information comes better decisions. And I think that the indicators movement should be thinking about, and in many cases is thinking about, other theories of how to drive change, such as a path-driven model that if we empower and provide resources to communities, communities will fill channels created for change. Mobilization-driven, the tried and trusted community development model of change, as well as the external model of change, sort of the peak oil approach, or federal policy shifts, major sort of shifts in policy that can drive change from a sort of a reactionary approach. Thanks. I'm looking forward to the discussion.